Have you worked it out yet? So yes, that's Down Under by Men at Work, and it's a brilliant song, especially for us Aussies. I'd absolutely love it. But what has that got to do with ships? Well, it became the theme of the 1983 America's Cup Challenge, when Australia 2 actually beat the Americans for the first time since the whole thing really began. So Dennis Conner was not happy. Right, on to our next story here. We're up to number 38 now. This is the story of the SS Kiwi. The SS Kiwi was built in Hull, England in 1875. She was an iron steamer of 133 tons and 115 feet in length. She had 3 masts so she could raise sails when the winds were favourable to increase her speed. She made the journey from Hull to New Zealand in February, the trip taking 157 days. Upon arrival in this country, she was immediately admired. So much so that the papers called her the best and most complete, profitable, useful boat of her size yet seen in New Zealand. She had a top speed of 12 knots, and the papers concluded their statements by saying, "We have no doubt the SS Kiwi will be a favourite boat in the trade for which she is intended." Her first trip was in August, just weeks after arriving here, when she delivered mail to Napier. From here she started her service around the country and was indeed a favourite boat in the trade. During the first 10 years of her service, her name appeared over 2,500 times in the New Zealand newspapers. She was kept quite busy. The SS Kiwi was involved with a rescue operation in September of 1885. While steaming off Napier, she came across the brigantine Gleaner. The Gleaner had lost most of her masts and sails and was struggling with what she had left. She was spotted by the steamer because of her distress lights. The SS Kiwi towed the Gleaner into the safety of Napier Harbour. In March of 1886, she was the scene of a tragedy. A crewman by the name of Schultz went missing from the vessel. He had been a crew member for over 2 years, so it was unusual for him to have disappeared. He was found a few days later floating in the harbour, believed to have fallen overboard and drowned. 2 years later, the SS Kiwi was steaming off Pencarrow Head when her propeller shaft broke. Powerless, she sent out a distress signal. Rescue services immediately sailed from the lighthouse, but on arrival at the scene, they realised it was a different kind of distress. The steamer Stella then towed the immobilised SS Kiwi back into Wellington for repairs. On the 11th of April 1894, the SS Kiwi left Wellington for Flat Point, where she dropped off some cargo. From there she headed north, following the coast approximately 3 kilometres offshore. Captain Campbell was then relieved at the helm by one of the crew and told them to maintain the current course. He then went and stood on the deck. At 4:15 p.m. Campbell was talking to one of the crew when they felt the SS Kiwi shudder beneath them. It was only a slight tremor. Men in the engine room and the forward compartments didn't feel it at all, but it was enough to make him concerned. Captain Campbell looked over the side and saw the surface of the sea much closer to the deck than it should have been. He was convinced they were sinking and called for the pumps to be started. Though they were turned on, no water came out. He then rushed to where the anchor chain was kept, the chain locker, and saw it was full of water. The SS Kiwi was sinking. The lifeboat was lowered and everybody clambered in, which included one of the crew's daughters and a passenger. In all, 16 people were in the small boat. They were still 3 kilometres from shore and began rowing towards it. When they had travelled just 30 metres, they watched as the SS Kiwi disappeared beneath the waves. Quick action by Campbell ensured that every member of the crew and their passengers was saved. Had the collision occurred at night, he was of the opinion that every one of them would have perished. When they made it to shore, they were helped by Maori and taken to Glenburn Station. The inquiry into the incident blamed a pinnacle of rock that was unmarked on the charts as the cause of the sinking. The depth of the water where the collision occurred was 55 metres, so hitting a rock there was entirely unexpected. Right, and straight into the next one. This is the story of Sovereign. The Sovereign was built in New Zealand by Sims and Brown of North Shore and launched on the 9th of November 1880. She was 77 feet long and weighed 97 tonnes. The newspapers from the time described the day she was launched. When the shores were knocked away, she glided gracefully into the harbour, and there floated another beautiful addition to our local fleet. Over the next few years, Sovereign worked as a cargo vessel, travelling throughout New Zealand and the Pacific. In 1889, on a trip to Brisbane, the vessel was driven ashore in strong winds. After unloading her cargo, the Sovereign was able to be refloated and lived to sail another day. In 1893, the Sovereign had just taken a load of copra from the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, for Sydney, when she experienced a cyclone. She was feared lost with all hands, but several days later she sailed into Sydney Harbour showing no signs of damage. The following year, the Sovereign left Mercury Bay on the Coromandel Peninsula for Wellington with a cargo of timber. She would not be so fortunate this time. The voyage had gone well until the night of 18th of June 1894, when she struck a heavy gale off the Wairarapa coast. The strength of the wind increased and the seas became rougher. Soon the Sovereign had sprung a leak and was taking on water. To make matters worse, the weather showed no signs of abating. The seas became higher and the wind stronger. As the Sovereign battled the elements throughout the night, her hull took more and more water until she became too heavy to navigate. Many of the deck fittings had been washed away, and the captain was faced with the reality that he was going to lose his ship. It was now a certainty that the Sovereign was going to founder, so he made the hard decision to purposely beach her to save his crew. At lunchtime the following day, the Sovereign came to rest on the beach of Mataikona. Captain Cachion and all of the crew made it off safely, but the damage to the Sovereign was critical. She had suffered a hull damage, and many of her deck fixtures had been ripped off, and her cargo of timber was now strewn up and down the beach. The crew spent the night at Mataikona Station, and as to escape the poor weather. Heavy rains continued to fall, and the Mataikona River, near where the Sovereign lay. That's interesting. No, I wrote that right. The crew spent the night at Mataikona Station to escape the poor weather. Heavy rains continued to fall, and the Mataikona River, near where the Sovereign now lay, flooded. The following day, the captain and his crew of 5 started a long walk out of the area. After 12 kilometres, they met a mail coach and were able to get a ride the rest of the way to Masterton, where they spent another night. They made it to Wellington on the 22nd of June, when they appeared before the Collector of Customs for the official inquiry on the stranding. Evidence was heard from the captain and 3 of his crew. From there, the crew were released. Captain Cachion returned to Auckland on 2nd of July and was later assigned a new ship, the scow Eclipse. Meanwhile, back at Mataikona, the seas were continuing their assault on the Sovereign. Part of the official inquiry required a visit to the stricken vessel, but this was cancelled when it was telegraphed that the Sovereign was breaking up. She had been beached for just a few days, but it was enough for the wild Wairarapa weather to deal its damage. The memory of the Sovereign was initially kept alive after the ship disappeared into the waves. Some of the timber from the wreck was salvaged by the Barton family of Mataikona Station to build a wool shed. But the salvaged timber did not last, and the last remnants of the Sovereign finally succumbed to the elements. Right, so that actually was number 39. So that actually makes us officially halfway through the shipwreck stories now. Hasn't taken all that long, so we're getting there. So now time for another piece of music. This is from the Pearl Harbor soundtrack. Despite the fact that that film is not entirely historically accurate, it does have a very nice soundtrack. So this is a piece called Tennessee, and it is by Hans Zimmer. And that was the brilliant Hans Zimmer from the Pearl Harbor soundtrack. Right, on to our last story for the day. It's that time already. And this is one of the more interesting ones. The further we progress, the more interesting stories we get attached to these particular shipwrecks. This is Delmira. So the Delmira was an iron barkentine built in 1864 at the Rudie shipyards in Chester, England. She weighed 338 tons and was 134 feet in length. Her early history reads something like from an adventure novel. The Sydney paper, the Daily Telegraph, reported at the time of her wrecking that she was originally called the Guaraz, or Guarani. She flew the Spanish flag and was reportedly involved in the slave trade before being sold to a Liverpool company. From 1874, her registered port was Melbourne, and she was engaged in the guano trade from Malden Island. Malden Island now belongs to Kiribati and is 2,800 kilometres south of Hawaii. It has the distinction of being the first place the British tested a hydrogen bomb, which occurred in 1957. Guano was a valuable resource at the time due to its use as a fertiliser. The operations on Malden Island were run by an Australian firm on behalf of the British. The United States had also tried to claim the island, but the Australian miners got there first. A rather unflattering article appeared in the Littleton Times in June of 1896 and explained the operations on the island. In the article, it referred to Malden Island as a small rock, an island if it can be dignified by such a name, and the most brutal description, nothing more than an inferior coral reef. The article went on to say that the guano was dug there all year round. The island had good facilities, and despite of what was being mined there, is exceedingly healthy, and few cases of sickness ever occurred there. At the same time the article was printed, there was a court case relating to the Delmira. The first mate, Neil MacDonald, after going on shore leave the day before, came to breakfast in a state not fit to come to the table. Captain Hutchinson took offence that MacDonald had not bothered to wash his face or comb his hair. He even had a clot of congealed blood on his forehead. When he was asked to leave the table without his breakfast but remain on board. Clearly wanting his breakfast, MacDonald disobeyed the order and made to leave. Hutchinson questioned as where he was going, and MacDonald replied, "Ashore to get my breakfast," and left the ship. He returned a few hours later, but only because he had been arrested. The case went before a judge, who after hearing the details dismissed it. The only person who gained from the incident was the lawyer who represented MacDonald. Shortly after the case, the cause of MacDonald's bloody forehead was revealed. In another court case, it was revealed that he had been in a fight with fellow crew member Anthony Rosney while on shore. MacDonald got off the hook for a second time in as many hours when the case was also dismissed. But this was not the end of the drama. Now it was Hutchinson's turn in court. He was charged with not keeping lime and lemon juice on board to help keep scurvy at bay. The most recent journey to Malden Island had taken 77 days to reach the island, and 44 days for the return trip. The boatswain, 2 crew members, and even Hutchinson's wife had become sick on the voyage. Hutchinson's argument, it was too difficult to obtain those kinds of supplies, so he had sailed without them. It was pointed out that this was required under the Mercantile Shipping Act. Hutchinson countered that Malden Island was not part of the United Kingdom, and so the Act didn't apply. The court determined that he had tried to supply his vessel with lemon and lime juice but could not find a supplier, and so was not to blame. This case was also dismissed. After a few days in port and 3 court cases, the Delmira sailed again for Malden Island on the 17th of July. It was to be one of her last voyages. After returning to New Zealand from Malden, the Delmira offloaded her cargo at Bluff in November of 1896. On the 1st of December she sailed again for Malden Island. but she did not make it out of New Zealand waters. Sailing north from Bluff, she was in favourable conditions until she reached Banks Peninsula. Strong winds grew and the Dalmera was forced north, ending up in Palliser Bay. Then the powerful winds that had pushed her this far faded away. A heavy swell rose up and the Dalmera was now being propelled towards the shore by the tide. Hutchinson tried to steer her from danger, but to no avail. She struck rocks, opening a huge gash in her hull, and she began to sink 2 miles from White Rock. The lifeboats were launched with full provisions and the crew were safely evacuated. Captain Hutchinson and his chief officer remained on board until another vessel, the Kahu, came and took away the crew, but not before Hutchinson received his box of 250 sovereigns, which were the wages for the loading crew on Malden Island. The Dalmera was stated to be a total loss by Hutchinson and was not insured. An assessment confirmed this, and the wreck was sold at auction the same month. Right, we've come to the end of another show, but before I go, I have another joke for you. I know you look forward to these. Why did the Admiral decide against buying a new hat? He was afraid of capsizing. Absolutely brilliant. Right, we'll catch up with you again next week. Same rec time, same rec channel. Have a brilliant week.